Hello and welcome to episode 65 of the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Mark Brooks OBE. It's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing today, Mark?
Yeah, all good, Lewis. Yeah, really good. Thank you.
Good. I'm super excited to get into this one. But as always, in your own words, Mark, what makes you a man?
Two things. First of all, innately a provider and protector, whether that's for my wife and family or whether that's for broader society and people who are vulnerable. And also, secondly, somebody who just wants to get things done. So that's the two aspects, provider and protector and getting things done.
Super succinct. I love it. It's great to hear. More traditional, but definitely something that a lot of people can sort of grab hold of as well. So, Mark, why don't you tell everyone what it is that you do in the space?
Well, I'm a policy advisor and communication advisor on men's health and inclusion. And I've done a number of things. I mean, first of all, writing policy reports, influencing government, making recommendations to government and public bodies about how they can better support men and boys. I speak at a lot of conferences and speak to and advise employers and other charities. Also, I'm involved in actually doing a lot of things. So not just talking and writing, but also I'm the chair of the Mankind Initiative, domestic abuse charity, also trustee of the Men and Boys Coalition, which is an umbrella charity for organisations and campaigners and charities and academics working in the field. And also I'm regularly on the media talking about these types of issues. So write policy, do a lot of speaking, but I'll do a lot of doing as well.
It's really interesting around the sort of policy side of things. What was your sort of opinion in regards to, I guess, the other side of the pond and this conversation around how the left lost men?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think the broader thing about the policy, in terms of my background as well. So my background is actually in marketing and communications. So I've been the director of two national charities, not in the men and boys field. So I've been involved in policy creation and communications and marketing for all of my career. So that's my professional background. And I think, so I've been able to apply that to my men in work in the men's field. And also that's really helped in terms of that kind of policy thinking with respect to getting policy. There's no point doing research. There's no point thinking about these types of issues if you aren't actually able to implement them, either through the government, public bodies, or broader societal narratives, and also around the creative industries. And the reason I mention that, and I do talk a lot, Lewis, is that coming back to your question, and I move around a lot as well. So coming back to your question, the key points for me about what happened in America was, first of all, it's not so much that men moved to the right in terms of wanting to vote. Trump, slightly more men vote, say in the UK for reform, for example, so slightly more right wing, slightly more men vote conservative than women, for example. But in America, I think it's more about the left moving away from men. And what we saw with the Democrats, and I've been talking a lot about this, is that actually they just weren't addressing men's issues. And in fact, they were actually approaching men as being the enemy or not being very progressive. Also almost lecturing men that if you vote for Trump and the Republicans, you're actually actively harming women. And so that just doesn't play well. There's no good asking people for your support if actually you're talking down to them and actually not offering any support to them. And there was some research on the Democrats' website, for example, that listed about 15 different groups that they were going to support. Not one of them was, they didn't mention men. Obviously, some men were in those groups, like veterans and LGBT plus men, for example, and obviously black men and men from different ethnicities, but it just didn't have the phrase men. So what was the offer for men in terms of what the Democrats were offering. Republicans, they just referenced men, but they didn't actually offer any solutions. My last point as well, there's been, again, a lot of rhetoric around, oh, well, Trump won because of men. Well, about 53 to 54% of men voted for Trump. So it's about 54%. So that meant 46% voted Democrats. And also about 44 to 45% of women voted Trump. But nobody's lecturing women who voted Trump about, they're part of the problem. So again, the narrative's been not helpful, and often it's not trying to get under the bonnet of actually looking at why men actually did vote for Trump. It's just having a go at men, in my opinion.
Well, that's a really interesting sort of way to end it, because it ties in quite nicely to, I guess, your marketing background and those sort of things. I've had a lot of conversations with men, and I think it's very common that a lot of men feel attacked around sort of the idea around feminism or violence against women. It seems to be there is no positive spin on being a man in this century or this year, for example. So what's your sort of take on that? What do businesses need to implement? What is missing for men to feel heard and, I guess, wanted in 2025?
Well, exactly. And I think things are changing, to be fair. I mean, I think there's been this broad narrative, and a good friend of mine, Glenn Paul, who's in Australia now, but is from England, came up with this phrase about 15 years ago about a narrative that all women have problems, all men are problems. And if men do have problems, it's their fault. So we've had this narrative, and it's starting to be eroded, but it has also been embedded in the DEI conversation as well, where conversation around inclusion and allyship has been very one-dimensional, not very multi-dimensional. I know there's been lots of pushback over the last couple of years about actually you can't be talking about inclusion if you don't include men in that conversation, but also not just in conversation, but also as somebody who needs help. And of course, when we're talking about men, whenever the kind of political lens around men tends to be guys like me, kind of guys like me. What I mean by like white, middle-aged guys, not working class guys who still sound like they're a chimney sweep. But it tends to be that kind of lens when actually men are like a Rubik's Cube. So all different intersectionalities about their class, where they live, their role, their ethnicity, sexuality, etc., whether they've got kids or not, and all of that sort of thing. But the political lens and societal lens, especially from, if you like, culture through media and others, tends to be white, male, and stale, guys like me, allegedly. So I think that's been part of the problem why men haven't feel not included. In addition, there's an assumption that men aren't involved in DEI types of activity. There's research showed about 50% of men said they don't feel included. But also there's an assumption that men aren't looking after women and other people in the workplace, looking after their safety, wanting to help women get on in work. There's just an assumption that men aren't doing it. But men do that anyway, but don't make a song and dance about it. Don't need to sign up to a DEI group. They just do it because they just do it. And, I've always said that, dads probably put their daughters first. Mums often look after their sons first. Statement I've said recently, was quoted in Parliament about that there's no greater champion for sons than mums. And so my long ramble is that men do feel pulled upon because they've been excluded from the conversation. But, and this is a great but, things are changing. We are seeing more employers recognise the need to support men. We've got about 35 male staff networks around the country, and it's growing rapidly. We've got a lot of political discussions now over the last 5 years. Men and boys issues have been really mainstreamed. So we have political debates, political research. And we've got men's health strategy coming now. The government have announced that. So things are moving and employers are moving. The one additional thing, if I may, Lewis, because I'm hogging, is what I call the blue collar, white collar differential. And what I'm finding is that a lot of policies that employers engage in terms of safeguarding health well-being at work, they're all aimed at Andy in accounts, but not Dave on the drains.
Yeah.
So they're basically written by people from quite a middle-class perspective in a nice, warm office, but they're not actually thinking about how they're applying those to men and, of course, women in frontline difficult jobs. And some of it encapsulates the whole discussion about working at home. I mean, we're going through a difficult weather situation now, lots of floods, lots of issues like that. Well, you'll have people in offices or working at home complaining that they're worried about power cut, whether their area is going to be flooded or not, but they're not really thinking about the people who are up at 2:00 in the morning trying to fix an electricity line or clear the roads, etc. So my issue really about employers now is that we need to look after men more and more, as well as women, of course. But also there's a need to have this blue collar lens, because the men on the front line in the warehouses, the drivers, the engineers, all of those people in manufacturing are the people actually more at risk of unhealthy lifestyles and actually health conditions.
Well, one of the first things that I used to talk about on this podcast was when I was interviewing someone was saying that this conversation that we're having right now is a privilege, especially when I was talking about mental health. Obviously, the podcast has sort of developed over time and sort of moved towards men. So I can see that as well, that there is a privilege bias to having mental health or even talking about it. And a lot of those industries that you talk about are dominantly male. That's just the way they are. Those are the sort of things that it is. I remember one of the first conversations that I ever had around this conversation and men opening up was when I was in my flat in Manchester. I could look out at the balcony and I could see the next block of flats being built, and I could see a man operating a crane. And I was like, he's got a lot of heavy material on the end of his crane. I can imagine that there is nowhere on God's green earth that he's able to speak to anyone that he works at that he's feeling a little bit down today, because he'd be out of that crane quicker than anyone has ever been out of anything. So for me, it is a very interesting space. Obviously, you talk about things are changing over the last few years. This is a space that you've been in for a while. So where do you see the shift for that sort of space? What does that look like in the future in regards to men?
Well, I think from a policy perspective, there's a number of perspectives. Policy perspective, I think, is about having gender sensitive policies. So we've got a men's health strategy coming, but it's one thing to have a strategy. It's about making sure it's implemented, especially at a local and regional level through the health system, the NHS, for example. So we've got a good chink of light there. We've also got more focus around suicide, albeit I don't think there's enough focus on different aspects of suicide, because the conversation obviously on suicide tends to be around middle-aged men. But I'm concerned about men in different occupations. So again, blue-collar men their suicide rates a lot higher. Men in the northeast and northwest, their suicide rates are twice as that of men in London, for example. So there's different aspects. So we've got good movement on health. We've also got good movement on employers, which is really, really good. We've also got some movement in trying to understand why so many men are in prison. You can fill Wembley Stadium right now with a number of men in prison. One area I think where there is still a gap is around boys, not only in terms of education achievement, but also male identity, and also men going into into skilled work. I mean, there's 200,000 young men at the moment who are unemployed. What are they doing? Why are they not in work? We've got labour shortages, etc. So, why is it those men haven't been able to find work? So there's some challenges, I think, around boys' education and work that really do need to address. And then at the other end, men in their late 40s and 50s in terms of employment, especially those who are physically unable to do construction and trade type jobs that as they used to because they're physically unable. And so there's a big job to be done on reskilling. So we're moving in the right direction, but we've still got a long way to go.
What is your thoughts around, one thing that you mentioned about boys is that mums are their biggest supporter. What do you think that a lot of the problems that we're having today with younger sort of generations is geared towards the increase in single parent homes and the decrease in sort of 50-50 custody in regards to boys in general?
Yeah, I think the lack of active fathers or positive male role models, because this could be stepfathers, etc. So, lack of positive male role models does impact boys in terms of their social development and also their educational development. And there's been research and continually about the impact of fatherless boys. So that is an impact because. And then you compound that with a lack of teachers in school, especially primary school. There's only about one in 7 primary school teachers are male, for example. A third of primary schools don't have male teachers at all, and so you've got a lack of male anchors in a lot of young men's lives. They don't know what it is to grow up to be a man, what their own personal responsibilities. And also perhaps some of the, understanding of having a man who's gone through what they're going through, especially you start to hit puberty, for example. So I think it does have an issue. The family courts is quite a vexed issue in terms of 50-50 contact. And the vast majority of people who go through divorces maintain positive relationships. There is an issue with those boys and girls who are going through a traumatic separation from their parents. But that's a really thorny issue and about 5 hours worth of a podcast, if I'm being honest.
No, it's a tricky, touchy subject that I find difficult to broach because it's designed to protect, but there's obviously always with any media, right? You're always going to hear the horror stories and the extremes. Whereas I think for the majority, it does work. I think it's just a case of ironing out a few kinks that, like you say, I'm in no position to be to sort of do that. Do you think also in regards to sort of women and girls specifically, we have this huge empowerment movement in regards to sort of like women in STEM and these sort of women can do anything, you can grow up to be whatever you want. And from the back of that, we've sort of lost traditional roles. So what you mentioned at the beginning, which is obviously being a provider and sort of going into that, there seems to be a lack of ambition maybe for boys. There seems to be a lack of direction when it comes to what it means to be a member of society, not necessarily a man. What's missing there, do you think?
Well, I think the narrative I come back to, I mentioned, is that there just doesn't seem to be enough positivity about boys and how great boys are and how great young men are and what great contributions that they make to themselves, their family, schools, and friends. And I think this has been the problem about narrative around toxic masculinity. All boys are listening every night to Andrew Tate, for example. That all boys are doing this type of thing. All boys are harming girls, for example. And I think that there just seems to be a downer about boys. And I think that what then's coming through is that boys aren't getting the grades. One of the pushbacks I said to online recently on LinkedIn was saying about young men, etc. I said, yeah, but they're not coming out of school. Too many of them can't read or write. or add up. So as I said, you've got to get those basics. You've got to get those basics right, because you can't take full part in society if you've got a cohort of young men every year who can't read or write or add up properly. They can't get a job. They can't put any roots down. 6,000 every year are excluded from schools in England. So we've got to make sure that they're supported. And I was on a call a few months ago where a lady was saying about a professor who was talking about that when boys exhibit problems at school, they're often looked at as kind of there's what the criminal sanction should be, but for girls when they're going through difficult or playing up, it's like what pastoral support they need. So so there's a different kind of reflection and actual response in the education system and society in general. And I think again that needs to be dealt with. The other thing about the jobs, again, a focus on STEM work for women, brilliant, no issues with that, but no equivalent courses, campaigns to get men and young men into health roles, into education roles, into literacy type roles at all. So it's kind of like, right, we'll have women moving into traditional male roles, which is all fine and proper, but there's no reciprocal move at all. And that's what really jars with me, because I cannot understand why there is this. And my last point, Lewis, is about what we're seeing is about 35,000 fewer boys, 18-year-old British boys, go to university than their female peers. And then what we're then seeing is in the professions, the majority of people going in to become GPs are women, some are lawyers. We're nearly at 50-50 in accountancy, for example. Psychology is 80% women now. So it isn't just about traditional male roles like engineering, but we're seeing a move. The professions are really all female dominated now, and the professional bodies in those areas are not doing anything about it.
Which is great, right? It's great for equality and those sort of things, but there's no, I think one of the things for me is there's no reduction in stigma. There still seems to be a stigma attached to going into nursing, for example, or going into teaching. There's a number of sort of serious stigmas, and there's also just like, it's a girly job. And then, but how does that make sense? I don't understand why there's never been a swap of conversation. It's like, well, for every girl that doesn't go into nursing that now goes into STEM, where does that boy go? Like, it surely was a logical thing to think about at the time, but you don't know what goes on behind the scenes, I guess. Is there much hope for boys? What, like, where do boys go? What does that mean for them?
Well, I think the conversation's turning. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation, and I think there's more pressure building politically about what do these men, boys and young men do? How are we going to integrate and make sure that all boys and young men have a positive future? And I think those figures around the crime figures, for example, boys not doing so well, the not in education, employment and training, I think they're starting to land. And I think, we got a new government. There's a lot of new MPs, new Labour MPs and Lib Dem MPs who are actually thinking about these questions. I think previous parliaments, there were some good MPs who were starting to put these issues on the table. But now we're seeing a lot more discussion about it, a lot more think tanks, a lot more charities, a lot more content like this, a lot more books, but also a lot more policy discussions. But it needs to move fast, because obviously every year there's another generation of 16-year-old young men coming out of school without any qualifications.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from society as a whole, it's only going to be better. Male teachers from primary school up to secondary school is just creating those positive male role models. I think you mentioned Andrew Tate and other manosphere sort of influencers that apparently all of the boys are looking at, but there's no alternative. There's no conversation around where do we start putting these people in. So I guess on that, what's your view on the patriarchy?
Well, that's always that's a thorny subject for me. Actually, well, not thorny. I mean, because I find it quite a kind of Marxist construction, and I'm not particularly big fan of Marxism, to be honest. So I find it as another way of actually trying to say that men, masculinity is a problem, and also the fact that even though, and when I push back on it, I've said to people, can women be misogynist, for example, when there's been debates on certain things, and it's like, well, yes, but it's kind of, but you've got pressures, the patriarchy. There's a lot of women as well as men, but a lot of women have expectations for men to be X, Y, and Z, as well as men. So it's an issue. I find it an issue that basically is another phrase like toxic masculinity and pale male and stale. And I was even thinking, somebody said to me today about man flu, and I was like, well, it's just flu, and so I just find it as a phrase that actually isn't very helpful. And a lot of this phraseology around that, well, men of all power. Well, there's lots of men there's a small number of men with huge amounts of power, but there's a vast number of men with no power at all because they're in prison, they're sleeping rough, for example. So again, I don't like those sorts of generalizations. I don't like that phrase.
Yeah, no, it's a phrase I hate too, for sure. There's definitely a few men benefiting from this so-called patriarchy. I think there's more nuances to it. So I've had a lot of conversations around sort of violence against women and girls and the safety that women feel in society as a whole, and that men sort of do benefit from that. So there's subsections of, let's call it patriarchy, or this society that we've created, that are probably true and make sense. But
yeah, absolutely.
I think the positives definitely do not outweigh the negatives when it comes to the benefits for the majority of men. So I do agree with that. From a marketing point of view, obviously you touched on these words and these sort of things. I've been saying for years now, I want the word manosphere back. I want that to be something that can be celebrated and used as a space for men and boys to be positive and talk about masculinity in a positive way. What sort of terminology do you think people should be using?
Well, I think it's interesting, that manosphere conversation, Lewis, because actually there's been quite a bit last year around actually what is the manosphere, because again, it's a bit like putting this adjective on it, like toxic masculinity, the word toxic, if that's a right phrase in terms of adjective. I didn't do so well in English in school, but it is a bit like the manosphere, because a lot of people were discussing, and I was obviously chipping into it, about people like Tate and others. They're just the extreme end of the manosphere. The manosphere is basically, whether that's online or whether that's men-only initiatives or for example, charities. I mean, that's all part of the manosphere. So I think it's really important to actually reclaim that term in 2025, because the manosphere is really important, because it's where men seek information and support, and the 99% of it is all very positive, and so that should be the actual focus, the focus on it. So from a marketing perspective, I mean, a lot of it, I just want to move away from these negative terms about toxic masculinity, for example, the manosphere. And we just need to start focusing on men as actual men. And then what I've kind of been thinking about, I've got this kind of three-pronged model about how men are, and that's respecting men's turf. So that's where they go. Respecting men's tongue, i.e. how they speak. I'm trying to find another word for begins with T. And also respecting men's terms, i.e. how men are, how their masculinity is, and actually respecting that. Now, obviously, there's always rough edges to all of that, but actually, it's about respecting how men are, and I think that that's really important coming into this year. And I think moving away from those types of terminology has to accelerate. To be fair, toxic masculinity, pound man style, and all of those types of phrase, man up, for example, are actually eroding and are being challenged. And the people who are challenging it the most, brilliantly, are women, which is fantastic.
It's good to hear. I think a lot of it sort of stemmed from the conversation around men need to talk. And then as soon as men started talking, we had all these problems, and people were talking about solutions to these problems that may be misogynistic or have misogynistic tendencies, shall we say. And I think it's all sort of evolved from that. It was like, maybe we shouldn't have told men to talk, but there's obviously benefits to that for sure as well. In regards to, let's talk about the other side of the manosphere, if you will. Let's sort of look at some of the work that you're doing as well in regards to the sort of charity space. Obviously, one of the charities that you're a part of is, like you say, an overseer, someone that's sort of positioning people where they need to go. So what's happening over there? What are some of the cool things that people should be looking out for?
Well, I think there's two areas. I mean, first of all, we're seeing a huge growth of what's called social prescription charities, i.e. by and for charities, set up primarily by men for men. And in plain English, that is men's sheds, anti-man's clubs, talk clubs, all of those which are happening right across the country, and they're growing exponentially. So that's been hugely important in that charity space. In some respects, they're a reflection of actually how the health system and society in general is failing. So they've been created by men really over the last 5 years. It's been a really big phenomenon. So that's been a really important area in terms of actually things that have been happening. In terms of the other charities that I'm involved in, the domestic abuse charity, we're seeing more and more men come forward to get help who are victims of domestic abuse. And the Men and Boys Coalition, this overarching charity, continually being listened to and also being the gateway from the government, the media and others to actually all of these other organisations and these issues as a whole. So again, things that the issue that always is, and is affecting all charities, is actually funding and money. So Men and Boys Coalition, we've got $5,000 in the bank. Doesn't go very long way. The trustees are all volunteers, and we're all doing things on top of work and top of things like that. So there still needs to be a lot more funding. My last point, really, big success is International Men's Day, which was in November. Men and Boys Coalition run that, and in the UK, and we've really been able to not only mainstream it, but make it a real success. So we estimated around 800 organisations were involved last year in the UK, which is huge. It was everywhere over a fortnight.
It's good to see. Like we had a conversation before we did the podcast, and I said, I've been doing this for 2.5 years. You've been doing it for a little bit longer. And even I'm seeing growth and things along that side, which is amazing to see and good to see. Sometimes you feel like you're tricking yourself because you're in the space and you go, oh, there's good stuff going on over here. But I'm having conversations outside of it, which seem to hope is good.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing you said a couple of times is that's a thorny issue, but yet you're part of a domestic violence charity for men, which some people would say is arguably the thorniest of issues for men. What are you finding in regards to stigma, talking about that around other women? What's the pushback or embrace for that?
Well, again, we're in a really positive space. I mean, I've been involved in that for a long time, and where it came from, I used to be a local elected councillor, and I helped a chap with 2 children get rehoused, and he had barriers because no one took him seriously, and his partner even had a conviction. So that's how I got into the subject. It has been difficult, but I think because the organisations, and the one I'm involved in has probably been is leading the way, is it's always about your tone and style and how you approach things. So recognising it's not a zero-sum game. So we're very much recognise that there's a lot more female victims than male victims, and we support all of Women's Aid and Refuge and all of their campaigns. Around 1 in 3 victims of domestic abuse are actually men, and these government figures, 1 in 7 men will suffer in their lifetime. So what we've been able to do is mainstream the conversation by focusing on men, but also recognising and supporting the need to make sure that women are supported. So we don't campaign for any money taken away from women and given to men. We're very active in campaigning for more services for everybody. There have been instances where I've walked in the room and the room's gone quiet, etc. But again, conversations moved on, and the majority of the people who run domestic abuse services are women, and the majority of domestic abuse services are really inclusive of men too. Again, it's how you approach it, is using that marketing thing, tone and style. It's so important to get right, making sure you're really inclusive, and also that you appreciate the other side of the coin. And I think that's how we've been able to make progress, to the point that there now is a service available for male victims of domestic abuse in every town, city and county in the UK.
I've actually worked with a domestic abuse charity in the past, very short period, but it was something I did. So I'm aware of the figures. I think at the time it was 1 in 6 men and 1 in 4 women. I think sadly those numbers have shortened, as in it's more, but I think that's arguably around people coming forward about it and the stigma sort of being removed. I think there's also a lot of stuff the reason that I say that is a lot of that stuff in that space is a lot of stuff that women were fighting for. So equality in marriages, so financial abuse, rape wasn't illegal in marriages until the 80s or 90s, as crazy as that sounds like. So that for me, it's almost like not an attack at it, but for some people they might see that as like trying to undo their work, right?
Yeah, and we've been very clear on that we're just kind of, appreciating and respecting that. I mean, when people say, some women, female friends that said that, told me that women couldn't get a mortgage or open a bank account unless a man signed the form. I mean, that was in the 70s. I mean, I just can't get my head round that. So I think it's about respecting what's happened before, and also being respectful of the conversation going forward. But there still is a huge amount of stigma around male victims in terms of them coming forward. So they do feel a real sense of enhanced shame, pride, undermining what it means to be a man. Obviously, that can be exacerbated by height and size differences. If they're with a female partner, we get 6'4" guys contacting us, and their partner, abusive partners, like a 5'4" woman. So they worry about how that looks and the shame and the stigma, not being able to look after their children, for example. But also on the flip side, we get a lack of professional and personal curiosity. So some men going to GPs or the police, not being taken seriously or not being asked questions. And also some family members as well, not recognising the signs that a man could be in an abusive relationship. Those things are changing, but there is still a huge amount of shame and stigma, and suicide ideation and all sorts of things around domestic abuse and male victims. And some of that is masculinity, but where does that come from? Some internal, but a lot of it's societal.
I think societal is probably the biggest one. I think there's a lot of shame in all things that it means to be a man these days. I think the way that society has changed and sort of stripped traditional roles and has created a fairer society for all, which is great and something that we should be pushing for. Yet they've forgot now what that means for men. And I think you touched on it before, which was really interesting. Can women be misogynistic? And I guess that sort of links into well, a man should be providing for me and a man should be doing this and these sort of things. So there's still people, I guess, like that want traditional roles, but these men are struggling to fulfill them, right? Because it's impossible to compete in an economic market like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the men who are victims of domestic abuse are part of the toolkit, if you like, of the perpetrator, especially again in heterosexual relationships, is around this language. What type of man are you? How are you? If you're a real man, you wouldn't be beating me. You wouldn't be allowing me to commit physical abuse against you. You know, what sort of man are you? You're not bringing enough money in the home. If you ring the police, I'm going to tell them you're the perpetrator. So some of these things play out all of the time. You know, using those old-fashioned tropes actually are used against men when they're victims of abusive relationships.
And as you sort of mentioned, that I feel for me one of the biggest issues with men and this generation of men and young boys coming up is this sheer push towards essential worthlessness. I feel that seems to be a common trend for a lot of men, is like, where am I in the world, right? And the worst case of that is obviously suicidal, either whether thoughts or action, and then there's obviously significant damaging things that sort of go back through society, if you will. In regards to sort of the men's space as a whole and things to look forward to, obviously with that little bit there, what are you excited for in the men's space over sort of the next 12 months? Or is there something that you sort of saw last year that you're excited to see continue this year?
Well, I think there's two or three things. I mean, first of all, men's health strategy, which I think will be a game changer. Hoping to be involved in that, and I actually, with an academic, Caroline Fleury, actually drafted and wrote a men's health strategy last summer. Because there's one thing to talk about, we need a strategy, but you need to sort of put forward some ideas about what would actually be in it. So that'd be really exciting. I think the second area is the growth in male staff networks. So I'm really excited about that. But also the bigger point is I'm really excited about this changing and evolving narrative, which is male positive rather than being male negative. And I think that started to really take shape in the last couple of years, especially last year. And I'm excited to see that continue. And that's really, really important, because that narrative actually then helps to shape everything else.
I think it's safe to say that real change is potentially on the horizon, which is great to see. Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you. I genuinely and will genuinely speak to you all day in the future, but I will leave the final thoughts with yourself. So please wrap it up. Let people know where they can find you if they want to find out more. And thanks once again, Mark, over to you.
Brilliant. If you go on, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm an active commentator on LinkedIn, but also importantly, if you're looking for charities to get involved in, go on there's a list on the ukmensday.org.uk. There's a list of charities that you can either get involved in or you can get help from. So always signpost men and anybody to that website.